Imagine being pulled over for no reason at all, on the very street where you live, only to have the truth of who you are turn the entire town upside down. Tonight we're diving into the true story of Margaret Ellis, a quiet widow whose strength and dignity exposed a broken system and sparked a revolution no one saw coming. Stick around, because the way she stands up and what happens when the police find out who her son is will leave you speechless. Before we jump in, let us know in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it right now? We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that truly matters. Silver Creek was the kind of town where nothing much happened after sunset. The sidewalks emptied early, porch lights flicked off by 9, and the hum of crickets filled the silence. It was a place where neighbors still borrowed sugar and kids rode their bikes until the street lamps buzzed to life. On this particular night, the mist hung low and heavy, blurring the edges of picket fences and polished driveways. Margaret Ellis, dressed in a simple gray coat and navy dress, drove slowly down Cottonwood Drive, her hands steady on the wheel. She had just left a candlelight vigil honoring her late husband, Robert, a man who had fought for civil rights long before it was popular to do so. Grief clung to Margaret like a second skin. Every turn of the wheel, every streetlight reflected a memory. Dinners shared, marches walked, dreams built and lost. Tonight was supposed to be about closure. Instead, a creeping sense of unease began to follow her. It started with the faint reflection of headlights in her rearview mirror. At first she thought little of it. Just another car taking the same turns. But as she weaved through the familiar streets, the vehicle behind her, a police SUV, never drifted away. Each block it matched her speed, each turn it mimicked. Margaret's heart rate didn't spike from fear but from familiarity. She had lived nearly 7 decades as a black woman in America. She understood what it meant to be watched. Still, she clung to hope. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe she was imagining things. But when she turned onto Sycamore Lane, the SUV's red and blue lights flashed to life, painting the quiet street in colors of urgency and accusation. She sighed, pulled over smoothly under a flickering street lamp, and set her hands firmly on the wheel. Margaret moved slowly and deliberately. She retrieved her license and registration from her purse and placed them on the passenger seat in plain sight. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. The door of the patrol SUV slammed shut. Heavy boots struck the wet concrete with a rhythm that reminded her of drum beats from long-ago marches. A flashlight beam swept across the rear of her car, lingered on the plates, then moved up to her rear window. A voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the night air. "Driver, roll down your window." Margaret complied without hesitation, turning the crank slowly, her movements deliberate and open. The officer, Haley Dunn, young, white, and sharp-eyed, leaned into the beam of her flashlight. "License and registration," she barked, her tone lacking the courtesy one might expect during a routine stop. Margaret gestured calmly toward the documents already laid out. "They're right there, officer," she said, her voice even but steady. Dunn didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, she stared at Margaret a beat too long, suspicion clear in her posture. "What brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" Dunn demanded. Margaret met her gaze without flinching. "I live 2 blocks over. I'm heading home from a vigil for my husband." There was a pause, a tightening of Dunn's jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "These Georgia plates?" Dunn said, her voice thick with skepticism. "When did you move here?" Margaret kept her voice composed. 3 months ago. To be closer to my son." Another pause, a deepening tension in the fog. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Dunn ordered suddenly. Margaret blinked, registering the escalation. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" she asked, her tone still polite, but edged with the steel of someone who had been through moments like this before. Dunn's reply came sharp and fast. "Step out of the car, now!" The authority in her voice left no room for discussion. Margaret knew from experience that arguing would only worsen things. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the cold mist. The fog wrapped around her, amplifying every sound, every sharp intake of breath. Officer Dunn's flashlight remained trained on her chest, her other hand hovering dangerously close to her weapon. Margaret kept her hands visible, raising them slightly, projecting complete compliance. But inside, a storm was brewing, not just of fear, but of indignation, of a long, tired sadness that she had to live through this yet again. Haley circled the vehicle like a hawk, tossing questions over her shoulder without real interest in the answers. "Where were you headed again?" she demanded. "Home," Margaret repeated calmly. "2 blocks over." "And why didn't you pull over sooner?" Dunn pressed. Margaret's jaw clenched slightly. "I wasn't aware I needed to. I pulled over as soon as you activated your lights." The accusation that followed was thin and cruel. "You were swerving," Dunn claimed, rewriting the truth in real time. Margaret said nothing. Her silence wasn't agreement, it was exhaustion. She knew the game being played, had seen it many times before. In the houses lining the street, porch lights flickered behind curtains, but no one came out, no one intervened. No one questioned why a well-dressed widow was being treated like a criminal 2 blocks from her own home. As Margaret stood silently under the weight of Dunn's scrutiny, a second police cruiser rolled onto the scene. Another officer, older, heavier, with a graying mustache, stepped out. His name was Ray Collins. Without asking many questions, he accepted Dunn's version of events. Suspicious driver, out-of-state plates, possible evasion. He didn't look too hard at the situation. He didn't want to. When Collins asked if he could search her car, Margaret politely but firmly declined. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "You have no cause." Dunn smirked coldly. "We can get a warrant." Margaret's response was simple and unwavering. "Then do." That defiance, that refusal to submit to injustice, sealed her fate. Within minutes, Dunn declared Margaret under detention for obstruction, a vague and hollow charge used to justify her aggressive actions. The handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists, cutting into her skin. She flinched, not from the physical pain but from the deep, familiar ache of indignity. She was no threat. She was no criminal. Yet here she stood, a widow in mourning, shackled on the streets of her own neighborhood. But what Haley Dunn didn't know, and what would soon change everything, was that Margaret's silence wasn't surrender. It was strength. It was resolve. And her son, Mayor Julian Ellis, was already on his way. This night, which began with grief, was about to spark a reckoning that would shake Silver Creek to its core. Inside the cold, fluorescent-lit walls of the Silver Creek Police Department, Margaret Ellis sat in a holding room, hands resting in her lap, her posture straight despite the indignity of her situation. She had answered every question calmly, yet here she was, detained without cause. Across town, in the mayor's office, Julian Ellis was receiving a call that froze him mid-sentence. Hearing that his mother had been taken into custody, his instincts kicked in faster than reason or protocol. He didn't argue, didn't delegate. He simply grabbed his coat, left the building, and raced toward the station with a single thought. They had no idea who they had just wronged. Meanwhile, inside the station, Officer Haley Dunn typed up her report, her fingers moving quickly, the words blending truth with enough fiction to justify her actions. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. She had stopped a driver with out-of-state plates. She had asked questions. She had followed procedure, or so she told herself. Yet the uneasy glances from some of her colleagues suggested otherwise. Officer Miguel Torres, who had already seen a copy of the bystanders video, knew exactly what the footage showed. Margaret was no threat, no disrespect, no resistance, just a tired, grieving woman who was treated like a criminal because of assumptions rooted too deep to admit. Torres approached Chief Halstead quietly, showing him the recording on his phone. They watched it together, the grim reality unfolding in flickering pixels. Margaret calm, Dunn aggressive, commands given without basis. Chief Halstead's face darkened. He knew instantly that they were sitting on a bomb, not just because of who Margaret was, but because it was wrong and wrong in a way that could no longer be hidden. At that moment, a call from the mayor came through, and the last traces of normalcy at the Silver Creek Police Department evaporated. Julian Ellis's voice was low and sharp, his message clear. "My mother is being held in your station. You will release her now and you will explain yourselves publicly. If not, the town would wake up to a scandal it could not contain." Chief Holstead didn't hesitate. Orders were barked down the hallway. Margaret's cuffs were removed. Apologies were offered, shallow, hurried, and meaningless. Margaret accepted none of them. Her silence spoke louder than any protest. When Julian arrived, the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Reporters were already gathering. Cell phones were pointed at the doors. The video, first posted anonymously, had already been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. Justice for Margaret. Silver Creek Truth. Silver Creek, once a sleepy town, was now at the center of a storm. Julian didn't hug his mother immediately. He walked to her side, placed a hand gently on her arm, and addressed the officers and journalists assembled in the lobby. "What happened here tonight," he said, "is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a culture that has tolerated bias for far too long, and it will change." His voice was calm, but beneath it pulsed a fury that no one could miss. The cameras caught every word. Inside the station, Officer Dunn watched from a side hallway. Her gut churned as the consequences of her actions became real. She wasn't just facing an internal review. She was facing the wrath of a community and a mayor with the power to make systemic changes. She thought about the forms she had filled, the procedures she had cut corners on, the instincts she had followed without questioning where they came from. Outside, Margaret stood tall under the flashing cameras, embodying the quiet strength that had always defined her. She wasn't giving speeches. She wasn't demanding headlines. She was simply present, and in that presence there was undeniable power. The press wanted a quote. Margaret said little, only that she hoped the truth would speak for itself. In many ways, it already had. Over the next few hours, the video went from viral to national news. It aired on local broadcasts, was dissected on talk shows, and ignited debate across social media. Silver Creek wasn't ready for this attention, but it had no choice. Every uncomfortable conversation that had been avoided for years was suddenly impossible to ignore. Jim Hartley, the retired firefighter who recorded the original footage, became an unexpected voice in the chaos. Interviewed outside his home, he spoke simply. "I filmed it because I knew if I didn't, nobody would believe it happened like that." And he was right. Without the footage, Margaret's story would have been twisted or buried. With it, denial was no longer an option. As protests began forming outside the police station and in the town square, Margaret stayed at home. She sat quietly on her porch, sipping tea, accepting visitors who came not to gawk but to offer support. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now crossed the lawn with casseroles and heartfelt apologies. Young people set up candlelight vigils. Older residents wrote letters to the local newspaper, calling for reforms they should have demanded long ago. Inside the department, chaos reigned. Internal Affairs was notified. Body camera footage from other stops made by Officer Dunn was requested. A preliminary review suggested a disturbing pattern: traffic stops disproportionately targeting Black and Latino residents, citations issued without probable cause, complaints dismissed without review. What had happened to Margaret was not a fluke. It was part of a larger systemic problem. Chief Holstead knew the department would never be the same. He convened an emergency meeting with senior staff. Changes would have to be made, and quickly. Officer Dunn was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. An independent review board was discussed for the first time, and for perhaps the first time in Silver Creek's recent memory, the conversation wasn't about preserving reputation. It was about reckoning with reality. Margaret, meanwhile, became a symbol far beyond Silver Creek. National news outlets requested interviews. Civil rights organizations reached out. But she remained focused on her community. Her son Julian, torn between political responsibilities and personal anger, worked behind the scenes to initiate formal policy changes. His mother's dignity gave him strength, and her refusal to lash out publicly allowed him to build alliances that would matter in the days ahead. As the second night fell over Silver Creek, candles lit up the streets. Protesters held signs not of anger alone, but of hope. Hope that this time the town would not simply move on. Hope that Margaret Ellis's quiet resistance would not be forgotten, but would instead mark the beginning of real, lasting change. What Haley Dunn triggered with her actions wasn't just public outrage. It was the unraveling of an old, rotting system, held together by silence and fear. And in the center of it all stood Margaret, not seeking revenge, not shouting for retribution, but standing, quietly, firmly, for something deeper, something permanent. And the town, for once, was listening. Morning in Silver Creek felt different. It wasn't just the buzz of news vans parked along the courthouse square or the protesters quietly gathering at the police station. It was in the air itself, charged and electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm. For the first time in decades, Silver Creek wasn't sleepwalking through its days. It was wide awake, staring directly at its own reflection. And many didn't like what they saw. Margaret Ellis sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, the news playing softly in the background. Her face, serene but firm, appeared on every local broadcast. Analysts debated what had happened. Was it racism? Was it just poor judgment? Should Officer Dunn be fired immediately? Some called for calm, others for action. Margaret herself refused to give interviews, at least for now. She believed the truth needed no embellishment. He had already spoken, in bright flashing lights, in cold handcuffs, in the weary but unbroken line of her back. Across town, at the police department, the walls were closing in. Officer Haley Dunn sat in a windowless room with her union representative. Her suspension was official. Internal affairs investigators were due to arrive within hours. The story wasn't just local anymore, it had been picked up by major networks. Haley told herself she had followed procedure, that she had acted within reason. But deep down, cracks had started to form in her certainty. What if she had been wrong? What if she had seen a threat where there was none because she was taught to see it? Meanwhile, Officer Miguel Torres gathered documents quietly, methodically. He had reviewed not only Margaret's footage but dozens of past incidents involving Officer Dunn. The patterns were undeniable. Disproportionate stops, aggressive language, complaints ignored. Torres wasn't looking to destroy his department. He was trying to save it by exposing the truth it had tried to bury. By midday, an emergency town council meeting was announced. The old community center filled faster than anyone had expected. Teachers, business owners, retirees, teenagers. They came not just to listen, but to demand answers. Mayor Julian Ellis stood before them, his voice steady but his heart pounding. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for patience. Instead, he promised immediate steps: an independent audit of the police department, the establishment of a civilian review board, and public hearings where anyone could share their experiences. The room erupted in applause. But there were skeptics, too. Some residents muttered about politics. Some officers grumbled about witch hunts. Change is never welcome where comfort has built its walls. Back outside, Margaret walked slowly toward the crowd gathered in the town square. Candles flickered in the daylight, symbols of mourning and hope alike. When she appeared, the crowd parted naturally. No one asked her to speak, no one shoved a microphone in her face. They simply watched as she placed a single white flower at the base of the flagpole and stood there, head bowed. That silent act said more than any speech could have. Inside the police station, Chief Holstead watched the protests through the blinds of his office. He knew Silver Creek was at a crossroads. It was no longer about one officer or one mistake. It was about a culture that had allowed prejudice to fester under the cover of procedure. It was about a community forced to confront itself. Later that afternoon, Torres met privately with Margaret. She welcomed him into her home with a quiet nod. No small talk, no pretense. He showed her the preliminary findings: documents, body cam footage, statistics. Margaret listened carefully. When Torres finished, he asked her one simple question. "What would you want us to do?" Margaret answered without hesitation. Tell the truth. All of it. Even when it's uncomfortable. Torres nodded. He had expected something more complicated. Instead, he received the one answer that required the most courage. Meanwhile, Officer Dunn sat alone at home, the TV blaring coverage of the protests. Her phone buzzed constantly. Friends, reporters, lawyers. She didn't answer. Somewhere deep inside, a realization gnawed at her. This wasn't going away. No clever report, no union protection could erase what had been seen. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the streets of Silver Creek. Protesters and residents gathered together, old divisions blurring under a shared sense of urgency. In neighborhoods once separated by silent lines of race and class, conversations started. Hard ones. Necessary ones. At the next town meeting, people lined up to speak. Maria Lopez, a local mother, told how she had been pulled over 3 times in 6 months, without reason. Earl Watkins, a retired teacher, shared how he'd been asked for ID while walking his own dog in his own neighborhood. Their voices were steady, but their pain was fresh. Margaret sat in the front row, listening. When her name was called, she rose slowly and approached the microphone. Her words were few, but they carried weight. "We can't fix what we refuse to face," she said. "We owe each other better." The room, packed wall to wall, fell silent, not from discomfort, but from acknowledgement. For the first time, Silver Creek wasn't pretending it was fine. It was hurting, but it was healing too. That night, Julian Ellis drafted new policy proposals. Torres compiled more evidence, and Margaret, under the soft light of her kitchen, wrote a letter to her late husband. She told him about the town, about the cracks that had broken open, about the hope glimmering at the edges. "You always said dignity isn't given," she wrote. "It's claimed. Tonight, we began claiming it." And outside, the town she loved, flawed, wounded, awakening, carried her hope forward, one conversation, one step at a time. The town of Silver Creek no longer moved at its usual sleepy pace. Each morning brought more headlines, more discussions, more protests. In homes, in coffee shops, in classrooms, people argued, cried, confessed. It was as if a great dam had cracked, and now decades of silence were flooding into every corner of the town. Margaret Ellis sat quietly in her living room, surrounded by flowers sent from strangers, letters piled high on her kitchen table. She didn't smile at the attention. She didn't celebrate. She simply read, listened, and prepared for the next step. Mayor Julian Ellis, meanwhile, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. With a team of advisors and civil rights advocates, he drafted a sweeping reform package that would restructure oversight of the police department, mandate the use of body cameras without exception, and make complaint processes transparent and accessible to the public. But every move he made was met with resistance. Inside the department, loyalty to the old ways remained strong among some. Certain officers whispered that Julian was undermining the force, betraying the people who protected the town. Some politicians accused him of exploiting his mother's incident for political gain. Julian ignored them. He knew the fight wasn't just about Margaret. It was about Silver Creek's soul. Officer Miguel Torres, once respected among his peers, now found himself isolated. Whispers followed him in the locker rooms. Glares met him in the hallways. Yet he continued his investigation into past abuses, driven not by anger but by a fierce loyalty to what he believed the badge should stand for. One afternoon, Torres met Margaret at the Ellis Center for Community Justice. Sitting at a small metal table, he handed her a stack of newly uncovered reports, stop-and-frisk incidents, internal complaints buried without hearings, community grievances dismissed out of hand. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she leafed through the pages, not from fear, but from the weight of so many unseen injustices. Outside the center, Jim Hartley organized weekly vigils. Dozens, then hundreds of people attended, lighting candles and holding signs. They didn't chant, they didn't scream, they stood silently, their presence a testament to a town that could no longer pretend ignorance. Meanwhile, Margaret expanded the Ellis Center's mission. She brought in lawyers to offer free consultations, held Know Your Rights seminars, and organized mentorship programs for young activists. The energy was raw, unpolished, but it was real. Silver Creek's heart was beating again, harder than ever. Inside the police department, Chief Holstead faced his own reckoning. For years, he had quietly tolerated practices he now saw for what they were: systemic failures, normalized discrimination, unchecked authority. He wasn't a bad man, but he had been a silent one, and now the price of that silence was clear. Holstead authorized full cooperation with the independent auditors, even when union representatives pushed back. He knew that saving the department meant first admitting its faults, no matter how painful that process would be. Haley Dunn, suspended and disgraced, moved out of her apartment under the cover of night. She avoided public places, avoided mirrors. In the beginning she had blamed Margaret. Then she blamed Julian. Then the media. But eventually, sitting alone in a borrowed room, she faced the hardest truth. No one had forced her to escalate that night. No one had made her treat Margaret Ellis as less than human. That decision had been hers alone. The first town hall meeting after the scandal was standing room only. The council chamber, usually filled with yawns and murmurs, now vibrated with tension. Residents took turns at the microphone. Some spoke with trembling voices about traffic stops gone wrong. Others described a lifetime of small, cutting indignities, the suspicious glances, the unreturned greetings, the quiet message that some did not truly belong. Julian listened to every word, taking notes, not promising immediate fixes but promising to stay, to listen, to fight. When Margaret spoke, the room fell utterly silent. She didn't rage. She didn't accuse. Instead, she told a story about her husband fighting for voting rights, about her children learning to walk with pride, about a lifetime spent believing that if you carried yourself with dignity, eventually dignity would be returned, and how, that night, she learned that carrying yourself with dignity was no guarantee, but it was still necessary. Her voice didn't tremble, it resonated, filled with a strength deeper than anger, older than fear. After her speech, something shifted in the room. Even those who had come to defend the status quo found themselves questioning what they thought they knew. Change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Outside, reporters crowded the sidewalks, eager for quotes. Margaret brushed past them. She hadn't come to build a platform, she had come to build a foundation. Across the town, storefronts began displaying signs that read, "We stand with Margaret." High school students organized a march for justice, and local artists painted murals depicting unity and resilience. The energy was contagious. Still, not everyone was on board. A counter-movement grew, fueled by fear and resentment. Anonymous flyers circulated warning about outsiders stirring up trouble. A few windows were smashed. Threats were whispered against those who spoke up. But the majority of Silver Creek for the first time refused to be silenced by intimidation. They stood firm, inspired by a widow who had not asked for a revolution, but had sparked one nonetheless. At night, Margaret often sat by the window, watching the town change outside her door. She knew real progress would take more than rallies and speeches. It would take legislation, education, reconciliation. It would take hard, unglamorous work. But as she looked at the candles flickering down the street, at the young people handing out flyers about voting rights, at the elderly neighbors she once thought indifferent now standing shoulder to shoulder with her, she allowed herself a small, tired, proud smile. One evening as the sun set over Silver Creek, a group of children approached the Ellis Center carrying handmade signs. They weren't part of any organized protest. They had come because they wanted to help. Margaret stepped outside to greet them. One little girl, no older than 7, looked up at her and said simply, "I want to be brave like you." Margaret knelt down, smiled gently, and replied, "You already are." The town of Silver Creek was no longer the same. It never would be again. And Margaret Ellis, who had once simply wanted to drive home quietly after a vigil, had become the quiet architect of a new beginning, one act of dignity at a time. As autumn deepened, the momentum in Silver Creek refused to slow. What started as a ripple had become a tide. Every week brought new initiatives, new faces stepping forward, and old voices returning with renewed strength. Margaret Ellis, though never seeking attention, remained at the heart of it all, not as a figurehead but as a steady presence, anchoring a community in flux. At the Ellis Center for Community Justice, the halls buzzed with life. Students from nearby colleges volunteered to tutor teenagers. Civil rights attorneys hosted open forums on legal rights and police accountability. Retired teachers started literacy programs, while social workers offered free counseling services to those who had carried silent trauma for too long. Margaret spent her days moving quietly through the building, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes just a hand on a shoulder when words weren't enough. Mayor Julian Ellis expanded the town's reforms. A civilian review board was officially sworn in, comprised of diverse residents from every ward. They were given full access to internal police investigations, a level of transparency unheard of before. New policies required all officers to undergo racial bias training, with independent evaluations every 6 months. Hiring practices were overhauled to ensure a force that reflected the community it served. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some senior officers resigned in protest. A few businesses posted signs subtly opposing the mayor's agenda. But for the most part, the town moved forward, pulled by a current stronger than nostalgia. Miguel Torres remained a controversial figure inside the department. Some branded him a traitor. Others, mostly younger recruits, began to see him as a model of integrity. Torres ignored the whispers. He knew change wasn't about popularity. It was about persistence. Late at night, he stayed at his desk reviewing old cases, identifying patterns of misconduct that had once been ignored. Every discovery was another step toward rebuilding a force that could be trusted again. Meanwhile, outside the police station, protests continued, but they evolved. Vigils became town cleanup days. Petitions for further reforms gained thousands of signatures. Churches and mosques organized interfaith dialogues. Schools began teaching local history, including the events surrounding Margaret's arrest, ensuring the next generation would not grow up blind to the cost of silence. Margaret often found herself at the center of these efforts without meaning to. One afternoon, during a panel discussion at the local high school, a student asked her, "How did you stay so calm that night?" Margaret paused before answering, "Because I wasn't standing alone. I was standing with every person who had been treated as less. I was carrying them with me. And when you carry others, you don't fall easily." That line traveled fast, quoted on social media, printed on banners, even etched into murals springing up across town. The image of Margaret Ellis, poised, dignified, unbroken, became a symbol not just of resistance, but of resilience. She represented the idea that standing firm in small moments could build bridges that large movements would later cross. But challenges persisted. Some national commentators tried to twist the story, painting Margaret as a tool of political correctness or accusing the town of overreacting. Margaret never engaged. She let her actions and the growing strength of Silver Creek speak louder than any accusation. Inside City Hall, Julian faced his own battles. Budget negotiations turned hostile. Longtime political allies distanced themselves. Threats, veiled and otherwise, arrived in anonymous letters. But he pressed on, knowing the reforms were fragile and could easily be reversed without constant vigilance. Late one evening, after a grueling council session, he visited the Ellis Center. He found his mother sitting quietly in the community garden, a soft blanket over her knees, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You're doing good work," she said simply when he approached. Julian sat beside her, exhaustion lining his face. "I'm afraid it's not enough," he admitted. Margaret smiled gently. "Nothing ever is. That's why we keep going." Across the street, Jim Hartley recorded another vigil. This time, it wasn't somber. Children played nearby, couples held hands. There was music, soft, hopeful. Jim panned his camera slowly, capturing a different side of protest, one that looked more like healing than rage. He uploaded the footage that night with a simple caption, "Silver Creek, becoming. At the police department, Internal Affairs completed its investigation into Officer Dunn. The findings were damning. A pattern of racial bias, procedural violations, and abuses of authority stretched back years. The department announced that it would recommend permanent decertification, preventing her from working in law enforcement again anywhere in the state. Dunn, now living in near isolation, faced a choice. She could fight the findings and drag the town through months of hearings, or she could accept the consequences. In a move that surprised many, she chose not to contest. No public statement, no apology, just a quiet exit from the profession she once claimed to honor. Margaret heard the news from Julian but showed little reaction. Her battle had never been about one officer. It was about a system. And that system was finally being forced to change. By late November, the town council approved funding for a permanent expansion of the Ellis Center, including a new legal aid clinic and a youth leadership program. Margaret attended the groundbreaking ceremony, shovel in hand, surrounded by smiling volunteers and laughing children. When asked to say a few words, she kept it brief. "This isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a future we build together." As winter approached, Silver Creek braced for more hard work. There were still divisions, still doubts, still wounds that would take years to heal. But for the first time in a long time, hope felt stronger than cynicism. One evening, as the first snow dusted the rooftops, Margaret walked through the town square. Lights twinkled in shop windows. Children bundled in scarves chased each other around the monument where, months ago, protesters had gathered in anger. She paused by the flagpole where she had once placed a single white flower. Now, at its base, a bronze plaque gleamed in the light. It read, "In honor of those who stood when standing was hardest." Margaret placed her hand gently on the plaque, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered, "Thank you." Not for herself, but for everyone who had chosen to believe that one small act of courage could ripple outward into something vast and unstoppable. And under the soft glow of winter's first light, Silver Creek kept moving forward. As the first heavy snows blanketed Silver Creek, a new rhythm settled over the town. It was quieter now, but not because the fire had died. It had simply moved underground, growing deeper, stronger, more permanent. What began as outrage had matured into resilience, and at the heart of it, Margaret Ellis continued to lead not with a megaphone, but with presence. Her influence, though unspoken, echoed through every meeting, every new initiative, and every hard conversation still unfolding behind closed doors. The Ellis Center for Community Justice officially opened its new wing 2 days before Christmas. Lines wrapped around the block as residents gathered, not for free giveaways or spectacle, but to see the promise of real change becoming brick and mortar. Inside, freshly painted rooms housed legal aid offices, youth mentorship spaces, and a library of civil rights history curated by volunteers. Margaret walked through the halls that evening, her fingers brushing lightly over door frames, her heart swelling at the laughter of children attending the first leadership workshop. Mayor Julian Ellis remained a relentless force for reform. Under his leadership, Silver Creek approved ordinances that made discriminatory policing punishable by automatic termination. A civilian-run equity council was created to review all city policies for bias. Public schools incorporated local civil rights history into their curriculum, ensuring that future generations would not grow up ignorant of the fight that had shaped their town. Every speech Julian gave, every policy he passed, carried the quiet signature of his mother's strength. Officer Miguel Torres, once isolated, now found himself a mentor to younger officers, determined to rebuild trust with the community. The department itself underwent a transformation. New recruits were trained not just in law enforcement techniques but in de-escalation, cultural competency, and community engagement. Body cameras became mandatory and tamper-proof. The monthly community meetings allowed citizens to voice concerns directly to the police and, most importantly, be heard without fear. Despite the progress, not all wounds healed easily. A small but vocal minority resisted the changes. Some officers resigned, citing a loss of tradition. A few older residents grumbled about too much change too fast. Margaret expected this. Change, she knew, was not a straight line. It twisted, it stalled, it met resistance. But it moved so long as enough people kept pushing. One cold January afternoon, Margaret sat down with Jim Hartley, the retired firefighter who had recorded the original video. They met at a small diner downtown, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. Over mugs of steaming coffee, Jim admitted that even he had once thought injustice was a thing of the past, something fixed long ago. Margaret smiled gently, not judging, simply listening. "The past isn't past," she said. "It lives in our habits, our fears, our silence. Change isn't remembering once. It's remembering every day." Across town, Maria Lopez, once too afraid to speak, now led workshops at the Ellis Center, teaching residents how to document police encounters safely and legally. Earl Watkins, the retired teacher, joined the new Equity Council, bringing decades of wisdom to a table that had once been closed to voices like his. Silver Creek's transformation was not just political. It was cultural. It was personal. Media attention faded as newer stories captured national headlines. Margaret was relieved. She hadn't started this journey for fame. She cared about results. But in smaller ways, Silver Creek's story continued to inspire. Other towns sent delegations to study their reforms. Universities invited Julian to speak about local governance and civil rights. And every so often, a stranger would send a letter to the Ellis Center. Simple words of thanks for proving that small towns could be capable of big change. Still, Margaret knew that symbolic victories were only the beginning. Real justice required constant tending. Every new policy needed to be enforced. Every community meeting needed to be meaningful, not performative. Every young person who came through the center needed to leave not just hopeful, but prepared to lead. On a rare, quiet night, Margaret stood alone in the Ellis Center garden, bundled against the cold, staring up at the stars. Snow crunched under her boots as she walked slowly down the lavender path, now dormant under winter's frost, but alive in memory. She stopped by the bronze plaque placed there months before. It read simply, "She stood." And so, we followed. Margaret traced the words with a gloved finger. She thought about Robert, her late husband, about the marches they attended together, about the nights they cried, the days they fought. She thought about the burden of staying dignified in the face of insult, of believing in change even when change seemed impossibly slow. She smiled softly, whispering to the night air, "We're still marching, love, just in new shoes." Inside, the center buzzed with life. High school students debated constitutional rights. Parents signed up for citizenship classes. Former skeptics now volunteered, side by side with long-time activists. It was messy, it was slow, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. Margaret wasn't naive. She knew more battles would come. She knew that anger could resurface, that progress could be rolled back with a single election or a single bad actor. But now Silver Creek had tasted something it couldn't unlearn, the power of standing together, and once a community knows its strength, it becomes much harder to silence again. As midnight neared, Margaret finally turned toward home. Her steps were slower now, her body older, but her spirit undiminished. In her window, a small candle flickered against the dark, a signal to anyone still out there struggling, still wondering if standing up mattered. It did. It always had. And as long as she had breath, Margaret Ellis would be there to remind them. Spring crept into Silver Creek slowly, brushing the town with warm winds and stubborn patches of wild flowers. Snow melted into the sidewalks, revealing not just green shoots, but signs of deeper change. Conversations once held in whispers now unfolded openly at bus stops, church gatherings, and school board meetings. The story of Margaret Ellis had shifted from headline to history, not something that faded, but something built upon every day. At the Ellis Center for Community Justice, the expansion was complete. Bright banners hung from the entrance, reading, "Our Voices, Our Future." Inside, children's laughter echoed down the newly added education wing. In one room, a civil rights archive was being curated by volunteers. In another, teens organized voter registration drives. Margaret moved through these spaces like a gardener tending a growing orchard. She didn't control the work, she nurtured it. Mayor Julian Ellis's leadership evolved alongside the town. Where once he had fought for every inch of progress, now he focused on sustaining it. The Equity Council, which had started as a fragile experiment, became an indispensable part of town governance. Policies were no longer passed without review for bias. New housing initiatives aimed to reverse years of subtle segregation. Even businesses adapted, creating internships targeted at underserved youth. Silver Creek wasn't perfect, but it was learning, evolving. Not everyone approved. A faction of traditionalists, frustrated by the town's direction, began organizing quietly, hoping to regain influence in the next election. They used phrases like, "preserve our values" and "protect tradition," thinly veiled calls to roll back the reforms. Margaret was well aware of their efforts. She didn't waste energy fighting them directly. She focused instead on strengthening what had been built, making it harder to dismantle by rooting it deeper in the community's everyday life. Miguel Torres continued to mentor young officers, emphasizing service over authority. His once lonely stance now felt less solitary. He wasn't the only one anymore. A new generation of recruits carried fresh perspectives shaped by the seismic shift Silver Creek had undergone. Torres often thought of Margaret when training them, reminding them in every lesson that respect, once given freely, had to be earned back twice as hard. Across town, Maria Lopez led a program empowering single mothers with legal and financial literacy. Earl Watkins partnered with schools to teach a new elective course, Local Heroes, Local History, where students learned not just about national civil rights figures, but about the people who had reshaped their own town. Jim Hartley's recordings, once spontaneous acts of witness, were compiled into a permanent archive at the town library. A reminder for future generations, this happened here. We made it better. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellis began quietly planning the next chapter. She resisted offers to write memoirs or star in documentaries. She wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity of struggle. Instead, she worked with educators to design a community leadership academy housed at the Ellis Center, a space where young people could learn the skills to organize, advocate, and legislate lasting change. She wanted her work to outlive her. One bright afternoon, Margaret stood before the first class of the Leadership Academy. They were an energetic mix, teenagers, young adults, some shy, some fierce, all carrying dreams bigger than the town's borders. Margaret looked at them and said simply, "Leadership isn't about being loud. It's about standing still when the ground shakes under you. It's about holding the door open for the next person, even when you were never invited through it yourself." The students hung on her words, not because they were poetic, but because they were lived. In that room, among those young faces, Margaret saw Silver Creek's future. Not easy, not perfect, but possible. As the season deepened, invitations poured in again. National conferences, award ceremonies, political gatherings. Margaret declined most, preferring instead to send students from the academy in her place. "Let them hear your voices," she said. "Mine has been heard enough." Julian supported her decision wholeheartedly, proud to see the movement evolve beyond their family, becoming truly communal. On the first anniversary of the Ellis Center's founding, the town held a celebration. There were speeches, music, a slideshow chronicling the year's growth. Margaret was honored, of course, but she spent most of the event on the sidelines, letting others take the spotlight. As the sun set, she wandered to the garden path behind the center, the same path where she often walked to think. There, among the lavender and new tulips, a small statue had been installed without her knowledge. It wasn't grandiose, just a bronze bench with her silhouette seated, gazing forward, hands folded calmly. A plaque read, "She taught us to stand by showing us how to sit with dignity." Margaret sat beside the statue for a moment, absorbing the scene. Families chatting nearby, young activists organizing tables of voter registration forms, police officers laughing and playing soccer with kids on the lawn. She felt a peace she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. Silver Creek would face hard days again, that was inevitable, but it would never again face them unprepared. or unaware, or alone. Margaret rose from the bench slowly. Her body ached, her steps were measured, but her spirit was light. As she turned toward the center, she spotted a small group of students gathered at the entrance, their faces bright with purpose. One of them held a sign that said simply, "Lead on." Margaret smiled, knowing that the legacy of what they had built wasn't hers alone to carry anymore. It belonged to all of them, and it was only just beginning. As summer unfolded across Silver Creek, a golden warmth settled over the town, but no one mistook the calm for complacency. Change, once an abstract dream, had become a daily practice, and Margaret Ellis, though stepping back from public view, remained its quiet guardian. She had no formal title, no political office, but her presence alone was enough to keep the fire burning in the hearts of those who had walked beside her. The Ellis Center for Community Justice buzzed with activity. Students who once came to learn were now leading workshops of their own. Young organizers planned voter drives, tenant rights campaigns, and town hall forums on environmental justice. In a small conference room, Margaret met weekly with a rotating group of these young leaders, guiding them not with speeches but with questions. Who are you bringing with you? Whose voice is missing from this room? What will you leave behind for those who come next? Across town, Mayor Julian Ellis expanded his vision. He pushed forward with initiatives to create affordable housing, invest in mental health services, and strengthen partnerships between the police department and community organizations. Silver Creek's national attention had faded, but that suited Julian. Real work, he knew, wasn't done under spotlights. It was done in the long, grinding hours when no one was watching. Officer Miguel Torres, now promoted to lieutenant, led the department's new Community Integrity Division. His unit wasn't designed to punish officers but to prevent harm before it could happen. Regular town forums, anonymous reporting tools, and a citizen advisory council were all parts of a system that no longer demanded blind trust but earned it. Still, tensions lingered at the edges. A group of former officials quietly lobbied to roll back some of the reforms, claiming they made policing too cautious. Margaret knew better than to underestimate such efforts. Change, she told her mentees, isn't permanent unless you protect it. You have to build not just walls of policy, but bridges of trust. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Margaret sat alone at the Ellis Center's garden, sipping tea from a battered thermos. The garden had blossomed wildly over the past year, a riot of color and life, much like the town itself. She thought about Robert, her late husband, and how he would have smiled to see it. Margaret had never set out to lead a movement. She simply refused to sit down when dignity demanded standing. And now, because she had stood, others were running toward futures they once thought were closed to them. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Tiana, the young girl who had once told Margaret she wanted to be brave like her. Now a confident teenager, Tiana was a leader in the Youth Organizing Council. She sat down beside Margaret, holding a worn notebook. "I wrote something," she said shyly. "Can I read it to you?" Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course." Tiana opened the notebook and began to read a poem she had written about Silver Creek, about pain and healing and the stubborn hope that grew in the cracks. Her voice was clear and sure, and by the end, Margaret's eyes shone with pride. "You have a gift," Margaret said when Tiana finished. Tiana looked down, blushing. "Only because you showed us it was okay to speak." Margaret reached out, gently taking Tiana's hand. "I didn't show you anything you didn't already have. I just reminded you it was yours." Across town, Jim Hartley edited a new video project. It wasn't about protest this time. It was about rebuilding. New businesses owned by Black and Latino entrepreneurs, community murals painted by high schoolers, block parties where people of every background gathered without fear. He called the project Silver Creek Rising. When it was posted online, it was shared thousands of times, not as a story of scandal, but as a story of recovery. Meanwhile, at City Hall, Julian met with mayors from neighboring towns, eager to replicate Silver Creek's reforms. He shared documents, frameworks, and most importantly, lessons learned through pain and persistence. "It's not about being perfect," he told them. "It's about being accountable. every day, especially when it's uncomfortable. As the year wore on, the Ellis Center launched its most ambitious program yet, a rural justice initiative aimed at connecting small towns facing similar struggles. Margaret was hesitant at first. She worried about losing the personal touch that had made their work so meaningful. But after seeing young leaders take ownership, she realized it wasn't about her anymore. It was about planting seeds and trusting they would grow. On the second anniversary of her wrongful arrest, the town gathered again, not for anger, but for celebration. The event was held on the town green, now renamed Ellis Park. Music filled the air, children played games. Speakers recounted the journey from that cold, misty night to this bright, open day. Margaret was called to the stage. She accepted the microphone with her usual modesty, looking out over the crowd, a crowd that no longer needed her to remind them who they could be. They knew now. "I didn't build this alone," she said simply. "I stood up once. But you, all of you, you kept standing. And now, you're building something better than any of us could have imagined. Don't stop. Not ever." The cheers were thunderous, not because Margaret demanded them, but because she had earned them. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting a golden glow over Ellis Park, Margaret sat on a bench near the stage. Children chased each other through the grass. Teenagers distributed voter registration forms. Police officers chatted easily with residents. Elders nodded approvingly, seeing their hopes reflected in the new generation's eyes. Then closed. No more picket fences to keep out grisly nutties. No more crime. The town willing to look at its own reflection, even when it was hard. A town willing to look at its own reflection, even when it was hard. A town that understood that justice wasn't a destination, but a practice, lived out one choice, one voice, one act of courage at a time. Margaret Ellis leaned back, closed her eyes, and smiled. The fire hadn't gone out. It had simply changed hands. And it was burning brighter than ever. As autumn returned to Silver Creek, the town's story grew deeper, richer, like roots settling firmly into the earth. The Ellis Center had become more than a building. It was now a living, breathing symbol of what a community could achieve when it refused to forget. Margaret Ellis watched the seasons change from her favorite spot in the garden, knowing the fight was no longer hers alone to carry. The seeds she had planted were blooming in ways even she had not dared to imagine. Inside the center, the first cohort of the Community Leadership Academy graduated. Dozens of young leaders, many of whom once doubted their voices mattered, now stood proudly before their families, mentors, and peers. Each had completed rigorous training in advocacy, public speaking, organizing, and negotiation. Margaret attended the ceremony, sitting quietly in the back until she was asked to speak. When she approached the podium, the room hushed, in respect. "You don't need me to tell you what comes next," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You already know. You don't wait for permission. You don't wait for the perfect moment. You move. You build. You lead." Her words settled into the young hearts before her, taking root, just as she had hoped. Mayor Julian Ellis, standing proudly at the side, knew his mother's influence would echo through the town for decades. The changes they had fought for, independent oversight, transparent policing, inclusive education, were no longer radical ideas, they were expected norms. The upcoming town council elections featured the most diverse slate of candidates in Silver Creek's history, a direct result of the shifts Margaret had helped spark. Still, not all battles were visible. Behind closed doors, certain power brokers schemed quietly, hoping to regain influence through backdoor deals and coded rhetoric. Margaret, ever wise to human nature, met with Julian late one evening at City Hall. Over black coffee and faded notes, she offered him advice he carried like armor. "You don't beat fear by shouting it down. You beat it by outlasting it. Stay steady. Let them exhaust themselves." At the Ellis Center, new initiatives launched. A conflict resolution program paired former adversaries in dialogue circles. A small business incubator helped residents once shut out of opportunities, to launch startups and cooperative ventures. The center's community garden expanded, providing free produce to local families. Every day, Margaret saw evidence that the town's heart was not just healing, it was growing stronger. Tiana, now an emerging youth leader, organized a regional summit for young activists. Invitations went out across the state, drawing hundreds to Silver Creek. For 3 days, workshops, panels, and late-night strategy sessions filled the town with a sense of urgency and hope. Margaret watched with quiet pride as Tiana stood on stage, addressing a sea of young faces. Change isn't something we inherit, it's something we choose to carry, every day with our heads high. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Miguel Torres worked with other departments across the county, sharing Silver Creek's hard-won lessons. His reputation had grown, not as a whistleblower, but as a builder, someone who understood that trust was as vital to public safety as any law or badge. Despite the progress, Margaret knew better than to believe the work was finished. Justice was not a destination. It was a road with no end, requiring constant vigilance. She taught that truth to every new cohort of leaders, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "We are not here to fix everything," she told them one evening, "but to make sure that nothing broken stays hidden." On a cool October night, the town gathered once more, this time not in protest but in celebration. They called it Ellis Day, an annual tradition to honor not just Margaret, but the spirit of dignity, courage, and resilience she had awakened. The celebration was simple: music, storytelling, and a communal meal shared under strings of lights across Ellis Park. Margaret sat quietly with her family, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She listened as residents told their stories. Tales of newfound courage, of battles fought and sometimes won, of lessons learned the hard way but carried forward with pride. She saw young people dreaming bigger than survival. They dreamed of leadership, of ownership, of legacy. Toward the end of the evening, Julian approached her with a small wooden box. Inside was a plaque, engraved not with titles or awards, but with a simple line of truth. "Because she stood, we learned how to walk together." Margaret traced the words with her fingertips, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing that the seeds she had planted had found good soil. Later that night, long after the music faded and the last lanterns were packed away, Margaret walked alone through the garden paths of the Ellis Center. The stars stretched wide above her, silent witnesses to a journey that had begun with sorrow and grown into something too big for any one person to hold. She paused by the statue bench, her likeness forever seated, gazing forward, and sat down beside it. For a moment she let the silence wash over her. Then she whispered to the statue, to the stars, to all those still finding their way, "Keep planting." And in the soft hush of the Silver Creek night, the future answered back, not in words, but in the steady, unbreakable rhythm of a community determined never to fall silent again. 10 years later, Silver Creek no longer resembled the small, fractured town it once was. It had blossomed into a vibrant, inclusive community, not perfect, but awake, aware, and unafraid to confront itself. What began with a wrongful traffic stop had grown into a movement that touched every aspect of civic life, and at the center of it all, though she had long stepped back from daily leadership, Margaret Ellis remained the heart. The Ellis Center now spanned 3 buildings, its walls lined with murals of protest and triumph, its halls filled with laughter, learning, and the steady hum of determination. Each year, the center trained hundreds of young activists, lawyers, teachers, and community leaders, many of whom returned to Silver Creek to continue the work. The Rural Justice Initiative, once a small idea, had expanded into neighboring states, connecting small towns across the region in a web of support and shared strategies for lasting reform. Margaret, now moving slower, her hair completely white, spent most of her days mentoring quietly, sitting in the sunlit reading room or the community garden she had helped build from a patch of dry earth. She didn't need a title or a stage. Her legacy spoke through the actions of others. Every protest turned into policy. every quiet voice that rose up stronger than before. Mayor Julian Ellis, older but just as passionate, continued serving not for the sake of power, but because the fight for justice was endless, and he knew no one was better equipped to lead Silver Creek through its next chapter. Offers had come, positions in Washington, speaking circuits, political dreams. But Julian stayed rooted where it mattered most, home. Tiana, the once shy girl with the notebook, now served as the executive director of the Ellis Center. Her voice commanded attention not because it was loud, but because it was sure, grounded in years of living the change Margaret had shown was possible. Under her leadership, the center launched new initiatives, mental health clinics, environmental justice campaigns, entrepreneurship hubs, all driven by the community for the community. And the story of Margaret Ellis lived far beyond the town borders. College students studied her case in courses on modern civil rights. A documentary, Standing Still, the Margaret Ellis story, aired on national television, reaching millions. The Ellis Center model was replicated in dozens of towns, proof that even the smallest places could hold the greatest change. But for Margaret, the true victories were smaller, quieter, and far more profound. It was seeing children, once fearful of flashing lights, now walking proudly to school alongside officers they trusted. It was hearing Spanish, Somali, English, and Vietnamese woven together on downtown sidewalks. It was knowing that in every classroom, young people learned not just national history but local truths about how a single night of injustice had sparked a decade of transformation. On a cool autumn evening, Silver Creek celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Ellis Center. The town green overflowed with residents, old and young, longtime families and newcomers, every color, every background. Julian opened the ceremony with brief remarks. "We are not gathered here because change is easy. We are gathered because change is worth everything." Tiana spoke next, her voice ringing clear. "We inherit not just the victories of those before us, but also their responsibilities. Today we honor Margaret Ellis, not by looking backward but by moving forward, boldly and together." Finally, Margaret was helped to the stage. The applause that greeted her wasn't loud in the sense of volume. It was loud in its depth, an ovation that vibrated with gratitude, respect, and a love too vast for words. Margaret didn't speak long. She didn't need to. She looked out over the faces gathered before her, so many she knew, so many she had helped raise up, and said simply, "Thank you for proving that dignity is stronger than fear. Keep proving it." Then she sat down, her hand resting lightly over her heart. That night, candles were lit across Ellis Park, and songs of hope and resilience filled the air. As the stars blinked open in the sky, the future of Silver Creek felt as real and solid as the soil beneath their feet. Margaret Ellis passed away quietly in her sleep 6 months later, wrapped in the peace she had spent a lifetime fighting to create. Her funeral overflowed with people from all walks of life, children she had taught, activists she had inspired, leaders who had learned at her feet. But there were no long, grand speeches, no overblown tributes. Margaret had insisted on it. Instead, each person was asked to bring a single seed, literal or symbolic, and plant it somewhere they thought needed change. Thousands of seeds were planted that day. In Silver Creek, across the state, across the nation. And even now, years later, in small towns and big cities alike, gardens bloom where silence once grew, and people still gather to tell the story. Not the story of a traffic stop. Not the story of anger alone. The story of a woman who refused to be broken. A town that chose to wake up. And a future that, thanks to them, will never again be written in silence. Because Margaret Ellis showed the world one voice, one step, one stand is enough to change everything if we never stop choosing to rise. Margaret Ellis taught us that real change doesn't begin with grand speeches or sweeping gestures. It begins in the quiet moments, when someone refuses to back down, when a town chooses to listen, when dignity is defended, one small step at a time. Her story is not just Silver Creek's story. It's the story of every place where people believe in a future better than their past. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that even the smallest voices can spark the biggest changes, don't let it end here. Tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Drop a comment, we read every one. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that inspire courage, resilience, and hope. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds you the power to change the world begins with standing up, just once. Thank you for being part of this journey.